Elsbeth Pule kicked out of school. She would not learn the golden rule, held her breath until near death, then turned her wrath on old King Cruel. Chapter 16. It wasn't until Dave tried to retrieve the book from her that Elsbeth realized she was holding it in a vice grip. "That'll be enough," he said when he finally wrested the book from her hand. "No more questions." Dave glided smoothly back to his seat on what Elsbeth thought must surely be a layer of slime. On the way, he glanced at Nimble and said, "Your witness." Nimble stood and approached Elsbeth slowly. In fact, he moved so slowly that Elsbeth got the idea that he was stalling, still trying to think of what he might ask her. "Elsbeth, dear," he said finally, "please state for the court your biological age." "I'll be 12 next month," said Elsbeth. "Not even 12 years old," said Nimble, facing those in the audience, "and already plotting the overthrow of the government. To think that you, an 11-year-old girl, could defeat and dethrone the great, the powerful, the infallible King Cruel would be nothing short of insanity, would it not?" "I told you before," Elsbeth spoke just below a shout. "I'm not insane." "No more questions, Your Honor." Elsbeth sat stunned as Nimble walked back to the bench. "Wait, that's it?" she asked. "You may return to your seat, Ms. Pule," the bailiff instructed. No sooner had Elsbeth retaken her seat than Cruel stood and the bailiff shouted, "All rise," causing her to immediately spring to her feet again. "I'll be back with my decision shortly," Cruel announced before turning and abruptly walking out of the room. Elsbeth glared at Nimble, who was frantically rifling through the papers in his satchel. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Getting ready for my next case," he replied without making eye contact. "Tom Tom, the piper's son, has stolen another pig. It's his third offense, so it's not good, I'm afraid." "What about my case?" asked Elsbeth. "You mean to tell me that that was the whole trial? That was your entire defense?" "I think we made our point quite well," said Nimble. "And the good news is the judge really seemed to like you." "Like me? They say he tried to drown me when I was just a baby." "Well, he must have had a good reason," said Nimble. You must have done something." "I was a baby." "I've met some very disagreeable babies in my time," said Nimble. "A couple of them were real jerks, in fact." A second later, the doors of the courtroom opened again, and in walked the bailiff, ordering everyone to rise. Cruel entered and instructed all but the accused to be seated. Elsbeth, he said, was to remain standing for sentencing. He had come to a verdict after a mere 30 seconds of deliberation. The 4 guards appeared at her side, ready to escort her back to her prison home as the judge pronounced her guilty of all charges. Now the only thing left to be determined would be whether the judge would find it in the goodness of his heart to have Elsbeth beheaded before chopping off her hand. Back in her cell, that was all she could think about as she sat on the dirt floor, sobbing loudly into her palms, while Jack and Jill looked on with worry, and Georgie paced as furiously as one can on the confines of a tiny cell. "Are you sure?" he asked for a second time. "Are you sure he didn't mention me?" Elsbeth did not dignify Georgie's query with a response. As she saw it, she had already answered enough stupid questions during that horrible excuse for a trial. And now, here she sat, acting every bit like the type of person she had always found so annoying, a sniveling, blubbering, self-pitying mess. 3 days, she sputtered. 3 days from now, he's going to chop off my head and my hand." She examined her right hand, then brought it to her throat and imagined her head rolling into some cheap wicker basket, while crowds of people watched and cheered her premature death. Jack and Jill exchanged a look, each hoping the other would have some bit of wisdom to impart, something that might give Elsbeth a small measure of hope. "I'll never see my parents again," Elsbeth wept, "and they'll never know what became of me. How did this happen? How did my life turn into such a disaster?" "It's not as bad as you think," said Jill. Elsbeth glared at the woman and said, "Not as bad as I think? You named me Jacqueline Jillson." "It was a compromise," Jill admitted. "I think it's a quite beautiful name," said Jack, the undeclared winner of that compromise. Elsbeth resumed sobbing, and for once made no effort to stop it. In fact, the blubbering went on for the better part of the morning and afternoon. If she had only 3 days left to live, she felt it was entirely within her rights to spend them however she wished, and feeling sorry for herself was just as good a way as any. As nightfall approached, she alternated between crying, dozing on the hard ground, and pacing nervously about her cell. When the man with the handlebar mustache delivered her dinner, for Cruel wanted to ensure that Elsbeth would be healthy and well-nourished for the execution, Elsbeth drank some of the water from the metal cup, but left the bowl of boiled cabbage untouched, except to slide it away with her boot so as to better avoid the acrid smell. Just when she felt her anguish could not possibly be any greater, she felt a sharp shooting pain in her backside, which caused her to spring from the dirt floor. "Ow!" she cried, rubbing the affected area while scanning the ground for a scorpion or something else capable of causing such a sting. "What is it?" Jill asked. "What's wrong?" Elspeth noticed a small hole in the ground, surrounded by a tiny pile of dirt. From the hole rose something shiny and metallic. It was a teaspoon, and in that teaspoon was a bit of moist soil, which was quickly tossed aside and added to the pile. With a mild clang, the spoon shot out of the hole and landed on the dirt floor. The head of a small gray mouse popped through the hole. With quick, jerky movements, the mouse climbed out and assessed its surroundings. Elspeth noticed that the mouse, which otherwise had all the parts mice normally have, was missing its tail. "Excuse me," the mouse shouted, as well as a mouse can shout. "Would there be anybody here by the name of Elspeth Pyle?" "Pule," said Elspeth, who had never been very fond of rodents to begin with. "Close enough," said the gray mouse. "Name is Earl Grey." He then leaned over and shouted back into the hole, "Come on up, mates, we found her." One after the other, 2 more mice emerged from the hole. The first brown and lean, the second white and plump, and each with its tail every bit as missing as the gray ones. Quite immediately, the chubby white mouse walked right into the brown mouse as if the latter didn't exist. "Hey," the brown mouse protested, "watch where you're going. What are you, blind?" "Not funny," the white mouse replied. "Enough," commanded Earl Grey. "We don't have time for such nonsense. Now, let's get on with the rescue, shall we?" "Rescue? Did you hear that?" said Jack with a pump of his fist. "I told you fate would intervene." "This is fate intervening," said Elspeth. "A rescue attempt by 3 blind mice?" "Excuse me, madam," said Earl Grey with hands on his hips. "We're a bit visually impaired, perhaps, but not blind, I assure you." Meanwhile, the white mouse sniffed eagerly at the air. "Is that cabbage I smell?" "I don't know what it is, to be honest," said Elspeth, "but you're welcome to it." "Later," said Earl Grey. "Right now we've got heroics to perform." "You won't get away with this," said Georgie. "Attempted escape is punishable by death." "Only attempts that fail," said Earl Grey, "and we never fail. Now, allow me to introduce my co-heroes in this daring mission. This is James," he said, indicating the brown mouse. Then pointing toward the white one, he said, "And this is Barry." "James and Barry," said Elspeth. "You're Earl Grey, and these 2 are James Brown and Barry White?" "You've heard of us?" said Earl Grey, his furry little chest puffing out ever so slightly. "Stands to reason, I suppose. After all, this is not our first heroic rescue." "And how exactly do you plan on carrying out this heroic rescue?" asked Elspeth. "Wait, let me guess. We're all going to take a magic shrinking potion and escape through that tunnel." Elspeth gestured toward the mouse-sized hole in the floor. "No," responded Earl Grey quite impatiently. "We're going to go out the way you came in, right through the door." "Once more," countered Elspeth, "unless you have some sort of shrinking potion that will allow me to fit between the bars, that won't be possible. The door is locked shut." "Locks are made to be picked," said Earl Grey with a quick flex of his eyebrows. Then, turning to his fellow rescuers, he said, "Gentlemen?" James Brown and Barry White popped back into the hole and a brief moment later re-emerged carrying a long, sharp stick. In fact, it was a long, sharp, familiar-looking stick. "Well, well, well," said Jean. "We meet again. Look who's in dire need of Jean the Stick now." "You brought him?" Elspeth asked, not even trying to hide her disapproval. "You do realize he never shuts up." "Oh, yeah," Earl Grey admitted. "On the way here, I learned the entire history of sticks and all of their contributions to society." "I tell you, it's about time people gave us some respect," Jean spouted. "All we get are insults. People will say that someone lives out in the sticks, as if it's a bad thing. And if you think for a minute that a wolf could blow down a house made of us, then you'll believe anything you read. Pure fiction." When Jean finally finished, Elspeth sighed and said, "And you brought him because he's the only one we could think of that was pointy at the end and long enough to reach the lock," replied Earl Grey. "That's right," said Jean proudly. "Do you know how many sticks are out there?" "I do, and out of all of them, I was the only one up to the task." "How lucky for us," said Elspeth. And don't forget, I'm the one who sharpened you in the first place. If you hadn't, I'm sure someone else would have, said Jean. Then the grudge-holding stick began to perform what appeared to be some type of dance, wiggling about while the two mice struggled to keep hold of him. What the devil are you doing? Asked James Brown. Sorry, it's the water, said Jean. Looking around, the only water in any proximity to him was the amount that remained in Elsbeth's metal cup. My great-great-grandfather was a divining rod. Found most of the wells in this kingdom. It's in my blood, you might say. He might have found the well that led us to you, said Jack. Imagine that. Yes, said Jean, still twitching. Anyway, if you don't mind. Elsbeth took this to mean that she should dispose of the water, and did so by the most efficient way possible, by drinking it down in one gulp. Thank you, said Jean, instantly returning to a more relaxed state. All right, then, let's get to picking that lock, said Earl Grey, and he and the other mice began carrying Jean toward the back of Elsbeth's cell. Excuse me, she said, the door is this way. The mice quickly performed an about-face and headed for the locked door. The lighting in here is terrible, Earl Grey offered as an excuse. He and his fellow mice scurried between the bars and into the corridor. Okay, fellas, said Earl Grey, you know what to do. Elsbeth watched as the three visually impaired mice climbed, one on top of the other, forming a wobbly tower of rodents, a whopping 10 inches tall, which would be all the additional height they would need to reach the keyhole with the help of Jean, the indignant, pacifist, blabbermouth, grudge-holding stick. With Jean grasped tightly between his tiny mouse fingers, Earl Grey angled the stick toward the lock, missing on one occasion after another, until finally the mice upon which he was standing began to protest, first with grunts and moans and eventually with words. Hurry it up, would you? Cried James Brown. My back is killing me. You, protested Barry White. I'm the one on the bottom. I'm always the one on the bottom. Maybe we'd let you move up a notch if you just lay off the cheese and crackers once in a while, Earl Grey snarled. It's not my fault, Barry White responded. I've told you before, I have glandular issues. Elsbeth could only watch the infighting and ineptitude for so long before finally losing patience and, despite her general dislike of rodents, she said, If you want, I could just lift you up to the lock. The three mice froze, their faces cast in the position of those who have just been made aware that they are doing something incredibly stupid. Said Earl Grey. I suppose that would work just as well. No harm in trying, right, fellas? The others agreed, and Elsbeth slipped her palm through the bars, allowing the three mice to climb aboard. Brilliant idea, Jack beamed as he and Jill watched. That's our daughter, you know. A chip off the old block. Elsbeth brought the mice slowly upward, and their presence upon her palm caused an involuntary shiver that almost sent them tumbling back to the ground. Easy now, instructed Earl Grey as he inserted Jean into the keyhole and began probing the lock. I must have a steady surface from which to work. I'm sorry, said Elsbeth. No offense, but rodents give me the willies. Earl Grey seemed amused by this. Ironic, isn't it? He said with a chuckle, considering it was Willie who gave you the rodents. What do you mean? Asked Elsbeth. King William, Earl Grey replied. He hired us. King William lives? Gasped Jack. Oh, he's alive, all right, Elsbeth confirmed, and completely out of his mind. Still, I guess it was pretty nice of him to try to rescue me. That's King William for you, said Jack. Nice to a fault. Nice has little to do with it, I would imagine, said Jill. He knows that without our Elsbeth, he'll never be king again. It's dark in here, said Jean with an echo. Quiet, said Earl Grey in a loud, stern whisper. I require absolute silence. He continued to work the lock while listening intently until at last there it was, a distinct and unmistakable click. The door to Elsbeth's cell popped open, and for a brief moment no one said a thing. Yes, Jack cheered at last. He and his wife hugged each other tightly. You did it, marveled Jill. Of course I did, said Earl Grey. You, said Jean. Hello, see what I mean? Never any credit. Fine, Earl Grey conceded. It was a team effort. Excellence all around. Now let's get going while we still can. No, said Elsbeth. We're not going anywhere without Jack and Jill. Earl Grey squared up with Elsbeth and spoke as though there were no size difference between them. Now listen here, missy. We were paid our going rate for rescuing one person. Now you're suggesting we take 2 more for the same price? 3 more, said Georgie. What? Said Elsbeth, whipping her head around to make sure Georgie got a good look at her scowl. What makes you think we'd take you with us? Because if you don't, he'll kill me, said Georgie with a whimper. And I know you don't want that on your conscience. Please. He can't kill you over some stupid berries, said Elsbeth. Can and will, said Georgie. After all, he threw you down a well for something he was afraid you might do. I don't know, said Elsbeth. Just this morning you were offering to testify against me. Yes, Georgie admitted, and I hope you'll be able to accept my sincere apology. Anyway, I could be quite helpful to you. You may be free of that cell, but we've still got to sneak out of the castle, and no one knows this place better than I do. Elsbeth considered the facts of the matter and decided that it actually made good sense to add a backstabbing, bumbling, self-serving weasel to a group that already included 3 bumbling, partially blind mice, 2 strangers claiming to be her parents, and an annoying, blathering stick. All right, she said with a sigh of finality. We'll take you along. Thank you, said Georgie, practically melting with relief. You won't be sorry. But the matter was not so easily settled. I don't know, said Earl Grey. 4 people for the price of 1? Nope, afraid that won't do. I thought you said you were heroes, snapped Jill, her voice heavy with a kind of disappointment only a mother can convey. We are heroes, said Earl Grey. Heroes don't rescue people because they're being paid. They do it because it's the right thing, said Jill. Doing the right thing doesn't put crumbs and garbage on the table, Earl Grey retorted. If I can't appeal to your sense of common decency, said Jill, then perhaps I can convince you to do it for the sake of avenging your missing tails. I thought the farmer's wife cut off their tails, said Elsbeth. Ha! Typical, Earl Grey snorted. Always blaming things on the middle class. Anyway, they'll grow back, eventually, right? James Brown and Barry White quickly checked their backsides to see if anything might be sprouting up. Besides, tails are overrated. When it became apparent that there was nothing Jill could say to convince Earl Grey, Elsbeth spoke up. If you don't take everyone with you, she said, then I'm not going. And if I don't go, then there's no rescue, and you won't get a thing. Earl Grey seethed. He was not used to dealing with prisoners and hostages who were anything but grateful for having been rescued. All right, he said. He relented. We'll take the lot of you. But once we're out of here, I'm bringing the matter up with Winky right away. With equal efficiency, Earl Grey and Jean the Stick picked the locks in the other 2 cells, freeing Georgie, then Jack and Jill, who could not resist the overwhelming desire to hug their daughter for the first time in almost a dozen years. Under normal circumstances, Elsbeth might have objected to such familiarity, but there was something about it that seemed quite natural. Besides, the encounter was brief, as Georgie reminded them they still had a very long way to go before tasting true freedom. 3 visually impaired mice, 3 visually impaired mice. See how they run, see how they run. They all went after Cruel's Monterey Jack. He cut off their tails with a battle axe. Now you know the horrible facts of 3 visually impaired mice.